Hello, I'm Hári Sewell. I am responding to the report on racial and ethnic disparities, report that was published by the government in the United Kingdom at the end of March 2021. I have been considering the content of the report for a while with an intention of responding perhaps by a blog, but was kind of prompted to make an early response because, of course, many of you will be aware that I share a surname with the chair of the group, Tony Sewell. My name, of course, is Hári Sewell. I also work in the field of race equality and critical race theory. And because of that, it appears that many people have conflated my surname with that of Dr. Sewell's and has confused me as being the author of the report. So first, I just kind of wanted to set that record straight. I wasn't involved, I wasn't consulted, I wasn't the author, nor would I be. For those of you who know me and know my work, I'm sure you'd consider it a preposterous idea that I would be authoring a report of that nature. So why do I speak so strongly about the report? And clearly I'm talking about the content of the report. I'm not talking about the individual leading it, nor the other individuals involved. I'm interested in the content and critiquing that. And why does it matter to me? I mean, of course, it's my work. And some people will be expecting a response. Folk have already asked me, what are your views? How will you respond? But I kind of wanted to start at a personal level because it's clear that these things affect me. And, there are many stories which I share sometimes in the training courses I deliver and just in conversations amongst friends. But there's one that I haven't really spoken about much, which for me summarizes many of the challenges that we face as people of colour in the UK. So here's the story. I deliver training courses, as I've already said, and to many kinds of professionals, many disciplines, many contexts. On one occasion, I was delivering a course which was covering the subject of race inequality in a particular setting, and it was a conversation emerged during the course about an episode that my son had where he was stopped by the police in his vehicle 3 or 4 times in one evening in our local area. Once he was just outside the park waiting for his brother to come out. He had been there with friends and he said he'd pick him up. On another occasion, he had just kind of been sat eating some food that he had bought from the shop and was just at the side of the road eating, and had kind of been approached by police officers again on that occasion. So I kind of recounted this bizarre evening in the middle of the training course, and one of the participants said, "Oh, why do you think that happened?" And I said, well, my job here is just to kind of promote thinking, and left it at that. And that particular participant said, "Oh, come on, you must have a view about why you think that happened." So I kind of said, well, in my view, that is an example of how racism gets played out in people's lives on a daily basis. So the course carried on, and at 4:30 when it concluded, someone called me, a man called me outside and said, "Can I have a word?" and explained that though he was now in a different role, he had previously worked as a police officer and was deeply offended and upset by my comment in the session, and said, he didn't want to make an issue in front of everyone and cause me any difficulty, but he thought it was really important that he kind of came and tackled my assumption, and he was deeply offended. And he just kind of said, yeah, clearly before I was doing this work, I was a police officer, and, I know what I've kind of seen. And he then just said as a parting shot, and to be honest, both you and I know there's a lot more to that story than what you said in there. I couldn't speak. I was both really upset, as in I felt like I wanted to burst into tears, and I just couldn't find the words. So he walked off, and thus ended the conversation. The reality is, my son has had no contact with the police. They've grown up as privileged lads, my 2 sons. They're the kind of kids who've been to archery courses, been rowing on the River Thames. This particular son of mine was playing saxophone in the Royal Albert Hall when he was 8 years old. I mean, they've had that kind of life. So the assumption of this ex-police officer, oh, we both know there's more to that story, just seemed so bizarre and outside of our experience as a family. And I tell you that because it kind of summarizes the experience we have, where there are assumptions being made that based on whatever experiences this chap had in the police force, he felt it was justifiable to come and say that and to draw me in to his version of the story that we both know there was more to it than that. There was nothing other than the experience that I had recounted. And the issue around that is it would be easy to individualize that particular episode and say, oh, there was something bad, something evil about this particular person. And of course, what we know is that what he articulated was the reflection of what has become systematic forms of discrimination, where people are seen as being a type, the stereotyping, but how that's woven into the fabric of organizations. And, what was really clear about that interaction was the confidence he had that he knew the truth, which was, of course, an untruth. So what about the report itself? And, I'm sure many of you will be aware of the kind of backlash and the oppositional arguments. I'm not just responding to what's been in the headlines. I've looked through the report. It's over 250 pages long, and it takes a lot of reading. And, I'll say hands up, I've not read every single page in detail, but I have gone through the report because I wanted to speak on it with some confidence. So, one of the big kind of critiques is there's a lot more to the racial variations and inequalities than racism. And in the report, there's a definition of institutional racism. And in fact, what's taken as the definition is the one from the William McPherson report into the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And what we know on page 28 of that report, there's a 55-word definition, which is often cited, including by myself, as a standard definition of institutional racism. What's missing in this report, unlike when I write and speak on it, is the acknowledgement that the definition and the kind of whole idea of institutional racism was developed by two African-American men, Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton. Carmichael changed his name to Kwame Ture, you may have heard him referred to as such. And they wrote a book called Black Power, which was published in 1970 in the States. And they developed this kind of understanding of institutional racism. And it's really striking that given the nature of that term, they are whitewashed out of the story and the definition of institutional racism. And a white middle-class barrister who, as we know, died recently, is often cited as the kind of founding thinker of that notion. That, in a way, in its very basic form, tells us about how institutional racism works, where people with advantage, people with a platform, are able to be spotlighted and their version of a story becomes the standard. Now, that's just one thing in the report which begins to give us a flavour of it. Another challenge of the content of the report is the articulation of the view that there is more to the story than it just being racism. And what that does, it speaks as if there is not a broader social context. One element of the broader social context that the report doesn't acknowledge is that many people of colour are experiencing a denial of their experiences on a day-by-day basis multiple times. I gave you an example of that in my own experience at the start of this. Now, when a report seeks to tell the truth that actually, things are complex, multifaceted, one needs to be really mindful to not give fuel to an argument that says, people are blaming it on racism and it's because people have got a chip on their shoulder, or it's because people aren't taking responsibility. And the report doesn't do enough to contextualize those conversations. To have a report that leads with this idea that people are defaulting to an explanation of racism when in fact that isn't the cause is a fundamental challenge with the report. It doesn't accept that it gives fuel to those who wish to downplay the experiences of racism that people face. Another thing that the report does, it doesn't locate the present in the historical context. Now, there is a reality that we are living our history right now, right today. So because we know that race is a social construction, it tells us that there must be something other than biology which drives the disparities. The report isn't clear enough on that. So we're left with, is it something in the social context which predetermines some of these outcomes, or is there something cultural about particular groups, that means that some of these disparities emerge. So let's kind of explore the issue about, well, are these cultural norms things that are driving the disparities? We have to then ask, where do these cultures come from? So let's kind of think about this. At the point a child enters into the world, we know that if you're anything other than white, there's a lot stacked against you. So at that point, this child has no individual responsibility for the fact that their life chances are less. Literally, we know that once you enter the world, your life chances are going to be less on many of the key indices of a successful life. Now, at that point, there's often a lack of acknowledgement of that. The language in our society normally speaks around the meritocracy, an idea that we're all born with an equal chance. And that embedded thinking allows the denial of people's experiences. So kind of going back to the idea about the history and asking, well, where do the cultures emerge from? If someone has been born into a world with a whole lot of things stacked against them, well, we can say, well, what has led to this position? Well, we know that trauma is passed on from generation to generation. We know that inequalities are passed on because of the disadvantage. And in a society that doesn't do enough to redress those, in some way becomes complicit with that, because it both has a language of a meritocracy whilst knowing the reality that there isn't one, and then does something that isn't proportionate to the level of disadvantage. In a society that was seeking to balance out inequalities, we'd see more investment in the lives of people who are born into this level of disparity. And we know the history. We know that from the global north, from the west, there have been societies, there have been rich people who have gone and taken resources, including people as resources, and helped to build wealth in the global north at the expense of people in the global south. We know that we have industries and ideologies such as capitalism which drive inequalities. For example, the impact on the environment. Things we do because it's a sign of advancement and progress based on the ideologies in the global north and the west create disadvantage for others. So I mentioned about the climate crisis, as we know, affects everyone, but has a disproportionate impact on people from the global south. But yet still we fuel the behaviors and ideas that mean that we continue to damage the environment in that way. This is part of a historical pattern where those with the privilege to live a lifestyle do so and passport their violence in a way they don't have to see it each time we get an upgrade on our mobile phone or we get other devices. Of course, we feel we're entitled to do these things. In doing so, multinationals will be investing in programs and ways of developing their products for us that mean that people in the global south are disadvantaged as a consequence. We don't have to see that. All we see is the shiny new device in our hands. That's the nature of how cultures are then kind of created, where people with advantage continue to fuel a lifestyle that benefits them without having to come face to face with the direct impact because it is so diffuse. There's much in the report that acknowledges inequality. A lot of it still individualizes it, locates it in bad individuals or individuals making bad decisions. But what we know is that these belief systems are hardwired into our organizations. It isn't an accident. For example, the report refers to the experiences of the people who died in the Grenfell fire. It isn't an accident that the demographic was of a particular nature. It wasn't an accident that those voices who raised concerns about the risk of a fire weren't heard and taken on board. That this kind of reflects power dynamics that are in our society. So yeah, my name is Sewell. I wasn't involved in the report. I wouldn't have written a report that stated at the headline that institutional racism doesn't exist. I've seen it, I've lived it. There are advantages and disadvantages for people from all backgrounds, but the ones which are institutionalized means that people of color are more likely to have poorer outcomes on the main indices of success in our society in the UK. And to deny that, I think, is a real failure And as I said, to deny that in the context when we know that the dominant dialogue and discourse is that, well, this is about them and not about what the dominant group is doing, also reinforces stereotypes and assumptions which are unhelpful. So that's my response. I'm Harry. Thanks.